The sun was setting over the Montana plains when Jacob first saw her standing on that auction block, and something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in all his 47 years of living. She stood there with her chin up, despite everything, and her eyes held a kind of quiet dignity that reminded him of the wild horses he used to gentle back when his father was still alive. The auctioneer was calling out numbers and men were shouting back, and Jacob felt his jaw clench as he watched them look at her like she was nothing more than a piece of property to be bought and sold. He had come into town that day for supplies and nothing more, but now he found his hand going up almost without his permission, and his voice calling out a sum that made the other bidders fall silent. When the gavel came down, Jacob felt the weight of what he had just done settle onto his shoulders like a winter coat, and he wondered what his late wife Margaret would have thought of him bringing home a woman this way. The auctioneer gestured for him to come forward and collect what he had purchased, and Jacob's boots felt heavy as he climbed those wooden steps. Up close he could see she was younger than he had thought at first, maybe in her early 30s, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and eyes the color of creek water in springtime. She looked at him without speaking, and he saw no fear there, only a kind of watchful waiting. He paid the man and then stood there awkwardly for a moment before finally speaking in that low, quiet way he had. "My name is Jacob Brennan, and I have a ranch about 2 hours' ride from here." She nodded once, but did not offer her name. The auctioneer thrust some papers at him and said with an ugly grin that Jacob would need these for proof of purchase, and Jacob took them only so he could tear them up later, where no one could see. He offered her his arm to help her down from the platform, but she ignored it and climbed down herself, and he respected her for that. His horse was tied up outside the general store, and he untied the reins while she stood a few paces back, still silent and still watching. "I'll need to get you a horse," he said. "And there's a stable just down the way." She spoke, then for the first time, and her voice was softer than he expected. "I can ride double," she said, and Jacob nodded. He mounted up and then reached down to help her up behind him, and this time she took his hand and settled herself on the horse's back. They rode out of town as the last light was draining from the sky, and Jacob was aware of her sitting behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders for balance. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet, and Jacob found himself noticing small things like how she didn't complain even once and how she sat straight, even though she must have been tired. When they finally arrived at the ranch house, the stars were out in full and the night had turned cold the way it does in Montana, even in summer. He helped her down and led her inside to the small house he had built with his own hands 20 years before. The place was neat enough because Jacob kept it that way, but it had the empty feeling of a home where only one person lived. He lit a lamp and gestured toward the bedroom door. "You can sleep in there," he said, "and I'll take the couch out here." She looked at him then with something like confusion crossing her face. "You paid for me," she said quietly, and there was no emotion in her voice, just a statement of fact. "Now do it," she added. And Jacob felt something twist inside him. He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am," he said, and his voice was firm but gentle. "I didn't buy you to use you that way, and I won't be doing any such thing." She stared at him for a long moment as if trying to understand a language she had never heard before. "Then why did you buy me at all?" she asked. Jacob ran a hand through his graying hair and tried to find the right words, because it seemed like the right thing to do, he said finally. "Because my Margaret passed on 3 years ago and this house has been mighty quiet since then, and because you looked like you deserved better than what those other men had in mind." Her expression softened just slightly. "What do you want from me then?" "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said. "You can stay here as long as you like, and you can leave whenever you want, and in the meantime, I'd appreciate some help around the place, if you're willing. But if you're not, that's fine too." She was quiet for a long time, and Jacob waited. Finally, she said, "My name is Sarah." He repeated, and he liked the way it sounded. "It's good to meet you, Sarah, even under these strange circumstances." That first night, she did sleep in the bedroom, and Jacob made himself a bed on the old couch and lay there looking at the ceiling and wondering what on earth he had gotten himself into. The next morning he woke before dawn the way he always did and started the coffee, and by the time Sarah emerged from the bedroom dressed in the same worn clothes from the day before, the sun was just starting to come up. He offered her breakfast and she accepted, and they sat at the small kitchen table eating eggs and bread in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't hostile either. After breakfast, Jacob went out to tend to the horses and the cattle, and when he came back hours later, he found that Sarah had cleaned the entire house and had somehow managed to make lunch from the meager supplies in his pantry. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied, and that was all. The days began to fall into a pattern after that, and Jacob would rise early and do his work, and Sarah would keep the house and cook the meals, and they would eat together in the evening and talk a little bit more each time. She told him eventually about where she had come from and about the husband who had died and left her with nothing, and about the debts that had led to her standing on that auction block. He told her about Margaret, and about the life they had built together, and about how empty everything had felt after she was gone. Sometimes in the evenings they would sit on the porch and watch the sun go down over the plains, and Sarah would tell him stories about her childhood back in Pennsylvania, and he would tell her about learning to ranch from his father. Winter came early that year, and with it came the snow and the cold and the long dark nights. One evening, Jacob came in from checking on the livestock and found Sarah standing by the stove warming her hands, and he noticed how thin her dress was. The next day he rode into town and bought fabric, and when he gave it to her, she looked at him with something like wonder. "Make yourself something warm," he said, and she did. She sewed herself 2 new dresses and a warm shawl, and Jacob noticed how her face seemed to relax a little bit more each day. One night in December, when the snow was falling thick outside, Jacob was sitting by the fire mending a bridle when Sarah came and sat in the chair across from him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up and waited. "I was so angry when you brought me here," she said, and her voice was steady but soft. "I thought you were just like all the rest of them, pretending to be kind but really wanting the same things. But you weren't," she continued. "You kept your word about everything, and you treated me like a person, not like property." Jacob set down the bridle. "You are a person, Sarah," he said simply, "and you deserve to be treated as such." She looked at the fire for a long moment. "I want to stay," she said. "Finally. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to be here." Something in Jacob's chest loosened. "I'd like that very much," he said. Christmas came, and Jacob cut down a small pine tree, and Sarah decorated it with strings of popcorn and bits of ribbon. And it was the first Christmas in 3 years that didn't feel like a day to just endure. They gave each other simple gifts, and Jacob gave her a pair of warm gloves he had bought in town, and she gave him a scarf. She had knitted in secret. Spring arrived eventually, the way it always does, and the snow melted, and the grass turned green, and the calves were born. Sarah learned to ride, and Jacob taught her gently on the old mare, who was patient and kind, and soon she was riding out with him to check the fences and move the cattle. One day in April, they were riding back to the ranch house at sunset, and Sarah pulled her horse up alongside. "His Jacob," she said. He turned to look at her. "Thank you," she said. And her eyes were bright for what he asked, though. He thought he knew. "For seeing me," she said. "For treating me like I mattered when I had forgotten that I did." Jacob reached over and took her hand. "You've always mattered, Sarah," he said. "I just helped you remember." That summer, Jacob asked her if she would consider marrying him properly, and not because of any auction, but because he had come to love her and couldn't imagine his life without her in it. She said yes. They were married in the small church in town with just the pastor and his wife as witnesses, and afterward they rode back to the ranch that was now truly home for both of them. The years that followed were good ones, and they worked the ranch together, and they laughed together, and they sat on the porch together, watching the sunsets and talking about everything and nothing. Jacob sometimes thought back to that day when he had raised his hand at the auction, and he marveled at how one moment of following his instincts had changed everything. Sarah told him once that she had been rescued twice in her life, and when he asked what she meant, she said the first time was when he bought her freedom, and the second time was when he showed her what kindness looked like. But Jacob disagreed. "You rescued yourself," he told her. "I just happened to be there at the right time." They grew older together the way people do, and their hair turned gray, and their hands grew weathered from work, but their love only deepened. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Sarah would look at Jacob and think about how close she had come to a very different life, and how grateful she was that this gruff,